welcome to the Storm and Norman show, or two dumb white guys that are trying to figure out how to use GarageBand.
It's a long name. I like two dumb white guys. I like that being the name.
Anyway, my name is Paul Davidson. The man you just heard is Storm and Norman himself, Scott Norman, and we've deleted this now twice, so let's see if the third time is the charm.
This is it. You guys are going to hear this when this will go live on this. So I have some questions for you.
Okay.
I know you have the answers.
Yes.
Because I know from experience you have got me the answers. So let's just go ahead and start off. I know that you've been working on doing research here on a scholar, and specifically having to do with English and education. So who is that scholar? Go ahead and introduce me to this person.
Yes, her name is Dr. April Baker Bell. She is an assistant professor in the Department of English and African American and African Studies program at Michigan State.
So, Miss Baker Bell, now I do have a question that I didn't ask the first time, and that is, with Miss Baker Bell, how long has she been doing these studies? How many?
The earliest one, I think, was 2009-ish.
Okay.
So a lot of it has been here recently. In fact, most of it has been within the last couple of years, and that's whenever she has started her tenure track, which she does write a lot about. She writes a lot about her tenure track, her experience as an African-American woman in higher education, and the experiences that she has. So she actually wrote a very interesting article dealing with that one, but that's not any of the point that we're talking about today. Hers, which she is a big component of, like, using narratives to help you understand yourself, learn from yourself, mm-hmm. and help heal yourself a little bit. And healing is a big thing that she kind of talks about. For Loretta, a black woman literacy scholar's journey to self-prioritizing, self-preservation, and black feminist, womanist storytelling was the article that she discussed that with.
Okay, so that was kind of telling her backstory. So on that note, I guess we've got her backstory. What are the things that backstory has led her to focus on?
Yes, her main focus is on critical literacy. And as we mentioned earlier, whenever I first interacted with critical literacy, I thought it was critical thinking, but it is not.
We've got that Doc Frid background there.
Yes, and she is a advocate for critical literacy, similarly to how Dr. Fridley was an advocate for understanding by design. But no, critical thinking and critical literacy are not the same. You do have to perform critical thinking to have critical literacy, but critical thinking is analysis and evaluation of something to form a judgment, where critical literacy focuses more on analysis and analyzing and the merits and the faults, emphasis on faults of something. The reason why I emphasize faults is because traditionally culture and society has tended to favor straight white men while excluding or demeaning other groups.
Okay. So within those ideas then, what are kind of the big problems she wrestles with, I guess?
Well, she started off her career looking at African American language in the English classroom, and that's where originally what brought me to researching her. And now, in the last couple of years, she's kind of took more of a critical media bent to it, both involving critical literacy, both being critical about it. Just one is looking at African American language versus dominant American English, and the one is just looking at how the media portrays things.
Okay. So with the comparison then of the kind of colloquial African American English versus mainstream American English, as she discusses that, what are her general thoughts there? Is this a positive, negative? What's going on there?
Well, she's kind of falls into the line of, I asked you this earlier, and I'll ask you this again. What is more important, the ideas at the center of what a student's trying to express, or how they're expressing them?
Mm-hmm. And we came to the conclusion that the ideas themselves are what is important.
And that's what she would kind of agree with. And so it really doesn't matter how you structure the language. It's how you express yourself. It's more the ideas at the center of it. And so she questions why we force students, specifically African Americans, to go towards this more dominant English, mainstream English, instead of using their own African American language. And she kind of evaluates that because we put that hierarchy on the languages, we are kind of subjugating or saying that African American language is inferior, thus saying African Americans themselves are kind of inferior and are not, and we're enforcing a white supremacy as a result.
Okay, so earlier we kind of talked about how that affects students, and you mentioned that this kind of gets into something that, as somebody who does sociology, I know the terminology of code switching, where somebody alternates back and forth. So, what is her thought then on how these two things kind of link together?
Code switching is a bad thing. Code switching is a bad thing. Code switching, of course, is enforcing that superiority, and she says that you should be able to be comfortable expressing yourself how you feel. And she actually does she talks to students about it, and she performs a class with them. Actually, it's with a cooperating teacher. I forget what the cooperating teacher's name is. I didn't list her on the annotated bibliography I have in front of me. But in their conversations, those students point out, like, this doesn't sound proper, but why do I have to do this anyway? And so they note that because of them saying this doesn't sound proper, they kind of view their own ethnicity, their own race, and how they talk as a negative, and so that's a negative self-image that they have of themselves.
Okay, so she would say then that the idea of code switching, of saying, like, oh, we don't talk like that in the classroom, that would be something that is negative, especially for African American students.
Not just African American students. As we mentioned, we teach in a rural area, so we have a lot of people that want to talk in their twang, and that's perfectly fine as long as they're interacting with the ideas in a substantive way.
Mm-hmm. So I am prone to, sometimes I'll correct a student if I think they've mispronounced a word, and she would say that is actually negative for their education.
Depends on what it is.
Okay,
depends on what it is. Like the biggest thing is like ask versus ask. If you do that, then that possibly is. But if you are correcting how, if they said Rutherford instead of Rutherford be Hayes, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad one.
Okay.
Even though that is still kind of a, that's still kind of a bad,
tricky one. So I had several students who struggled a lot with Max Weber. Because he's got a W in his name, but he's from Germany. So that one might be one where I could explain the German background and the V sound.
And that's a little bit of what she tries to do with African American language and being critical with it. She's about teaching students in general about the rich history that is in African American language. And there is a rich, substantive, interesting way that African Americans have developed their own language, held strong to their own language from Africa through slavery, through the civil rights movement, and there is actually a rich rhetorical way that African Americans speak, and that needs to be examined, and not in a negative way, but not even necessarily being praised, but just being examined as a worthwhile thing.
Yeah, so basically allowing a student with that background, so whether it is a student who is from the Boot Heel of Missouri and calls it the Boot Hill, or it is an African-American student who has other forms of slang that they are using, or different terms that they are using, instead of just saying, you're doing it wrong, say, why are we doing it that way? And kind of looking at the history.
Exactly. Being more just understanding why, once again, the history, understanding why something is done. The why is the biggest question. Always ask them the why.
I gotcha. As a history teacher, I like that. I like turning English conversations into history conversations. That's always more exciting to me. So as we look at this, she has, in her background, looked at a lot of kind of the racial perspective on things. But I know that you talked about this shift, as she is coming from that, and she's beginning to shift into media literacy.
At least that was the last thing that she had published, dealt with media literacy. I don't know if she's necessarily giving up on African American language. I could see her continuing to research that, but there was this hot moment, and it's still existing now today, of when there was there was Black Death after Black Death after Black Death at the hands of police, and she, with a variety of other African American scholars, sat down and created a special edition of English Journal, an academic journal for English teachers, in which they discuss certain issues. And one of the things that she co-authored in that issue dealt with media literacy.
Okay. And so this is actually interesting because it's a clear overlap if she's looking at those specific cases and those things where you can see the lean in from her initial literacy conversations and the difference between races and areas that people are coming from, and then looking at, okay, well, how then might those influence media as well? So what are some of the things when she is discussing the media? How does she apply that? Is she looking at the same kinds of things about just how they're speaking, or is there something deeper to it?
It is a little bit of how the media is speaking. And me and you both have social studies teaching backgrounds.
Mhm.
That's what my undergrad is. That's what you do for a living.
Yes,
And
sir.
we are aware that the news is biased, and the news paints a narrative, and how you really can't trust one source. You have to look at a variety of
Fake
things
news.
in order to understand what's going on. And I know I take that a little bit for granted. I thought that everybody knew that, but I forget that I have a history teaching background. And so what she kind of says is that we need to teach our students to be literate in how the media constructs a narrative.
Mm-hmm. So one of those things, as a social studies teacher, we very often, well, actually every week in my government class, will look at various news articles, and I will have students who will come in with the same news article that I don't realize. My filter of reading, just glancing over them, doesn't catch that they're coming with the same exact topic because the headlines are so vastly different. Is that the kind of thing she's talking about?
Not necessarily that. It's more just there's and if you're a part of this class, that is probably the only people listening to this. We've been talking about covert racism a little bit with To Kill a Mockingbird, how whether or not it is still a relevant text to teach in schools today.
So what are some ways that To Kill a Mockingbird would not be current today? What are some?
Well, okay. The biggest thing was covert racism or silent racism versus overt or in-your-face type of racism. And To Kill a Mockingbird shows a lot of good in-your-face racism, but it also has a lot of silent racism, where it's, of course, Bob Buell's a racist, and of course the lynch mob is bad, but also Atticus kind of says things that are fairly racist, saying something along the lines of African Americans aren't ready to vote because of they're not educated enough. That is racist, and so that is kind of the racism that has now perpetuated. We're no longer as in your face with it. It's now that more covert, silent type of racism.
So it dealt with, she's wanting us to realize that if we're looking at that, talking about the literacy of this, she wants us to be able to help students see that the overt racism there isn't the only racism in the book, that they can't look at that and go like.
And this is not her. These are different scholars. I imagine she does have an opinion on teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, but I have not actually interacted with her thoughts on that. She's talking more about just media in general and that covert racism that exists in media. And there's certain patterns that actually it's another scholar that she's quoting on this, but she's saying that we need to teach our students about these.
So what are
patterns.
some of the patterns then that she is wanting us to be aware of, or wanting us to make our students aware of in media?
So she's just wanting to point out how society kind of whitewashes the stories. The media kind of whitewashes the stories to put black people down and perpetuate particular stereotypes. And one of the big stereotypes that she looks at, one of the patterns that she brings forward, is humanizing white criminals and dehumanizing black victims.
Mm-hmm. So this would be the thing we've just seen recently. The I can't remember the names, but there was the police officer, the off-duty police officer, that walked into someone else's home and shot the man in his own home.
And that was in Dallas. That was in Dallas. That was a little bit of that, and they were trying to humanize her.
And the first thing
criminal.
I saw about him was, well, they found weed in the home afterwards.
Exactly, and they were dehumanizing the victim of that particular problem. And then on top of that, like with any of the police shootings, they humanize the police officer, but they dehumanize the victim of the violence. And we'll get into this more with the compromising photos of black victims. That's the next pattern, where the black victim will be shown quote unquote throwing up a gang sign, which is really just a peace sign sometimes, and instead of him being a picture of them being graduating from high school.
So this is, I remember with the Trayvon Martin case, the initial pictures that came out were Trayvon Martin, like you said, throwing up gang signs and doing all of this, and the initial pictures that came out of the, I can't remember his name, I'm blank on the name, but the individual who shot him, the first picture was him like in a button-up shirt And
I think it was Michael Zimmerman.
Yeah, Zimmerman. And
I don't know if I'm racist for knowing that or not. I'm joking.
No.
I'm not gonna lie. This entire like experience preparing this, I'm like, I have dynamite in my hand.
Yeah, this is walking through a minefield while trying to explain the field to others.
I bet. Yeah. This time we haven't pointed out that we're two straight white guys.
Yeah, this is so we are coming at this as I'm asking questions. You're right, and this is something that I guess this is actually a good thing, that because we're discussing her work, we're being forced to step back out of some of our perspective.
Well, not even being forced, just like we are actually stepping back out of our perspectives and actually having these good substantive conversations. And she wants us to have these conversations with our students, and that is the big thing.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of these other ones? I've gotten us off track by bringing these things up into the minefield. But what are some of the other stereotypes that we are to be pointing out to, or the systems that we're pointing out to our students?
So we talked about humanizing white criminals, dehumanizing black victims, compromising photos of black victims, lone wolf characterizations of white criminals, saying that white criminals were kind of off by themselves. They didn't really interact with anybody, how they were just always quiet and whatnot, and forgetting to point out, like, they're terrorists. They performed heinous acts of violence against other people.
So that would be, and we've discussed this before, you and I have, but the individual who after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who came in and kind of demonstrated this idea where she, with her kid, I mean, this is like first graders, second graders, something. It was young kids. She's explaining to them racism, and to do this, she just picked an eye color each day, and then that eye color would have to undergo eye colorism, as an example of racism. And she would call on, let's say that the bad kids that day were green-eyed kids. She would call on a brown-eyed kid and say, "Did you do your homework?" And if they said no, she'd be like, "Well, next time you need to remember, you really need to get your homework done." And then she'd call on the green-eyed kid, and they didn't do their homework, and she'd go, "Look at this, green-eyed people." And shake her head and generalize that back to everybody. That's kind of what we're referring to here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then you have black children being represented as adults. That was the case in Ohio, and with the kid, the 14-year-old, I don't even think it was 14. I think it was a 12-year-old.
Yeah, I believe he's younger.
I'm making them seem more adult. They were playing with a toy gun, and the cop thought they had an actual gun, and they ended up shooting that poor child. And often you just see media say he was big for his age, or he was, why was he out there by himself, that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And trying to make it seem like they are more adults than they are, because they're actually children at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. So just basically making excuses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then the next one is self-defense versus guilty until proven innocent. That goes back to the Dallas approach of that, with saying, "Oh, she was trying to defend herself even though she wasn't in her apartment."
Yeah, she walked into someone else's home and defended herself.
But they usually will say, like, "Oh, the police was defending themselves," and this person, the African American that was killed, or the African American, is guilty until they can prove their own innocence. And then last but not least, the last one, which I feel is the most interesting one, is the double standard depictions of social justice movements. And then we get to there with the shooting not the same shooting. Dang, Dallas has a lot of shootings.
Dallas has lots of shootings.
Man, I think Dallas has some problems.
Now, not to get too deep into this, but they have had a lot of interesting conversations very similar to this, where their police force has since come out and basically said, we are going to do this education, and they have gone through a lot of these ideas you're depicting right here with their police force to try and kind of ready them, and so the actual number of shootings there has dropped.
Yeah, but the double standard of depictions of social justice movement, there was the shooter that was targeting police officers in Dallas a couple years ago, and the media automatically tried to tie that shooter to the Black Lives Matter movement, and they had no connection whatsoever, but they tried to make that connection just so they could take that one social justice movement and corrupt it.
Mm-hmm. And that is that idea of like the lone wolf versus, you hear the single racist man who shot the black church victims versus the Black Lives Matter member who shot the police officers.
Exactly, and those are the discussions we need to have with the students. Is just showing them how this narrative is painted, and to point out that this is not a good thing. We can all agree that this is not a thing that should be happening.
Yeah.
Now she talks about how we need to examine media through these patterns, and then she talks about how we need to extend those patterns, how we then need to put let students begin to have agency over the narrative. She even writes that English teachers hold the tools to discuss and critique and dismantle violence. And so we need to first acknowledge the wounds that exist and identify the culprit of the violence, and then respond to the wounds using tools that transform the conditions that led to the wound, which is create our own stories, create our own media that helps combat that negative story, those narratives that media is trying to put out.
Mm-hmm. And I like the fact that she says to heal the wound. This is not weaponizing them to inflict the wounds on the oppressor. This is something to allow students to see what is being done and then to create something healing from it.
And she's a big component of healing, especially through writing. She is a big advocate for narrative writing, which we are seeing an increase of usage of that, especially within our own state test of blended writing and using more narratives and making it more engaging. But she is a big component of she's a big advocate for using those narratives and helping students heal.
Okay. So we've seen all of these ideas, all of these big ideas from the two main areas you've given us. And whether it is the kind of language literacy or it is the media literacy, my question, because until we began this discussion, didn't have the background as much. I'm a history, social studies guy. You have taken the leap into English. So how do these ideas help us think about the foundations then of English education?
Which there's a lot of overlap between English and social studies. We do our standards are starting to merge, not differentiate.
Yes.
But the foundation, where does she come at with the foundations of English ed? She, at the birth of English, as a lot of you who are listening, who are in the class know, about 120 years ago, a group of 10, the Committee of 10 came together, and they took a bunch of these disparate subjects and shoved them together into what we now call English.
So just a quick question to clarify for me as a social studies teacher here, that honestly I should know this anyway, but what are some of these subjects that were squished into a pile here?
Grammar, linguistics, specifically literature, rhetoric, or as the article that I'm spacing on the name, but it resonated with me so much, they call it inquiry and expression. Those are the main ones that kind of, and speech too, got thrown into what we now call English. Speech, of course, broke off and it's like, nah, forget y'all, but everything else kind of stayed. And so that's the reason why you see people at English have to teach writing, literature, and grammar, which if you have ever been in a high school English class, at least in the last 100 years, for the longest time, there was this unholy marriage, or this bad marriage. I'm not going to say unholy, but a bad marriage that happened between literature and inquiry and expression, where you are inquiring about your thoughts and you're expressing your thoughts. So you're interacting with ideas. And they married these two things together, and as a result, literature took the front seat. Literature was the patriarch in this particular, if I'm going to continue down a critical literacy bent, we had a literature supremacy where English teachers focused a little bit too much on literature and not enough on that inquiry and expression. And what Baker Bell is kind of putting forward is that we need to focus more on those ideas, that interaction with ideas, the interaction of those thoughts, that inquiry and expression.
So we often talk a lot about the idea of students thinking versus students regurgitating. And I believe I stole the example from you of they are much more fluent in barfing things back up than making their own cakes.
That is true.
And so is this kind of what she's talking about, that they are not necessarily able to build their own narratives? They can repeat others' narratives, but they can't build their own.
Yeah, this is the big thing. That she wants them to be able to build their own narratives. She wants them to be able to, and not just be parrots of other people's narratives, and let those other narratives put forth a superiority of one group of thinking, of a white superiority over a minority point of view. I've went into the weeds. I need to edit this. I probably won't. So where to go from the beginning? All right.
So the original question, just to reframe it here, the original question that we were discussing is just the idea of, is her desire, because we have a tendency to discuss ability to create versus ability to regurgitate. Is she wanting students to be able to create their own narratives, and she thinks that changing literature to the back seat will help them be able to do that?
Well, she doesn't even necessarily say that literature needs to go to the back seat. She says that we need to interact with a wider variety of literature. But she is talking about how we need to allow students to have control, and not to have this top-down, the almighty power telling them exactly what to do. They need to be able to fight the man and not just complicitly listen to the man.
Okay, so now I'm curious. You say she wants different types of literature. So what do you mean by that?
A wider variety, a wider variety of people at the table. People that have not necessarily been able to have a voice because of the American literary canon being primarily put forward by straight white men. She wants us to be able to have people that have not had that voice be able to hear theirs.
Okay, so this is having authors represented in the classroom that otherwise wouldn't have been represented. Like, instead of having us, the straight white guys of the world, be the only authors that you're reading. You're reading things from African Americans. You're reading things from other countries and cultures and backgrounds.
And Native Americans and all that.
And so this would actually then cross over well into our language literacy, because then you will probably be reading things in a different dialect in the classroom, and you're reading it as a positive instead of reading it as a negative.
And that's one of the big things of the foundation of English that I was always critical of, and that I kind of agree with, is that why do we call it English whenever you can do these exact same skills and studies in other languages? So why
don't we call it language class?
Why don't we call it just inquiry and expression class? I'd like that, but no, yeah. Why do we call it English? And part of it's because imperialism, duh. But
the sun never sets on the English language.
Yep. But yeah, that's the big thing, that she wants just more contributors at the table.
So we've looked at this. We've talked about these different things. The last question that I have really for you is, as teachers, we see this stuff, we hear this stuff. I like these ideas. There's a lot of like interesting concepts that we've bounced off each other about how to handle this stuff. Do you have any ways that you think you're going to actually implement this in your class, or that I could implement this in a social, just some ways that we could actually apply these ideas?
I just do what she actually says. This is real world school. There's a schoolishness to school, but this is real world social studies. This is real world English, and having them be able to question the media, having them be able to actually interact with these things, are things that they'll do out in the real world. And so that as a result will make the students be more engaged, more invested in what they're doing. So we just need to take the advice and just be critical of the certain aspects of our own teaching and of our own curriculums.
So this is something else we've had a conversation about, but kind of the idea of being willing to be meta about your own.
Oh
thing.
Yeah.
So
they want to. She's a bit. She's probably. I'm speaking on her behalf. I've never actually met the woman, but I've. In the past 2 weeks,
studied a lot. Yeah.
For the past 3 days, I've reread a lot of her work. I do feel like she would applaud us being meta, and not just being meta with ourselves, being meta with our students. Allow our students to actually have a seat at the table in discussing their education.
All right. Is there anything else that I need to know as Scott Norman, social studies teacher, or that your class needs to know about this woman, April Baker Bell?
I'm pretty positive the first recording that we lost had everything that I said, and I guarantee you that I forgot stuff this time. And this is I do feel like this is a far inferior product to the first time. If there is anything I forgot, and just let us know on Canvas or in the comments, or
yeah, you can yell at him in the comments.
Yeah, you can yell at him at the comment. I'll forward the comments to you.
All right, he'll show me the comments.
But no, I think that's it for us.
Well, I guess we can go ahead and sign off, and I think officially we have earned the name Two Dumb White Guys.
And we have.
This has been Scott Norman.
And I'm Paul Davidson, and hopefully this wasn't a train wreck, and you'll hear us again one day.